want to thank our guests for their patience, and I will turn it over to Elliott Harris to present the World's Indigenous Peoples Volume 5 report. Elliott, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Steph. Ladies and gentlemen, the relationship of Indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources is an essential element of their identity, their well-being, and their cultures. The preservation of the environment, transmitted through traditional knowledge passed down through generations, is at the very center of their existence. As the world increasingly recognizes the negative impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on health, food security, and overall peace and security, the importance of Indigenous knowledge and their territorial rights is starting to be more fully acknowledged by the white society. The adoption of the 2030 Agenda offers further opportunities to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands, their territories, and the resources. It gives space to demonstrate the invaluable contribution of Indigenous stewardship of lands and territories. Securing Indigenous peoples' land rights contributes to decreasing poverty, SDG 1, for both individuals and families, because agriculture and infrastructure stimulate investment and growth, mitigate forced migration, and support food security, SDG 2. It also encourages long-term environmental benefits that are critical to meeting the SDGs, in particular SDG 13, combating climate change and its impacts. Although the SDGs represent progress in terms of addressing Indigenous concerns, they nonetheless contain many gaps and may involve potential risks for Indigenous people. For example, the 2030 Agenda does not fully recognize collective rights in relation to lands and resources, or to health, education, culture, and ways of living. And yet, collective rights lie at the very heart of Indigenous communities. The centrality of human rights in the 2030 Agenda is well established, and the SDGs address many of the key priority areas for Indigenous peoples. But serious challenges remain. In many areas of the world, Indigenous peoples' rights to land, territories, and resources remain limited or are unrecognized. In many instances, even where there is legal support for such rights, implementation is frequently stalled or inconsistent. Progress in securing these rights is often undermined by the detrimental effect of a development process that frequently threatens the lands and resources of many Indigenous peoples. Moreover, conflicts involving Indigenous peoples over land, territories, and resources have become more frequent. Attacks on Indigenous peoples' human rights defenders, which include Indigenous environmental human rights defenders, have increased dramatically in recent years. Indigenous human rights defenders and their land right activists face enormous risks and outright reprisals for defending their lands, including criminalization, harassment, assault, and killing. The continued conflicts and human rights violations related to their lands often also result in displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples, and in some instances, there is a heightened risk of statelessness, particularly for those Indigenous peoples whose traditional lands cross national borders. Ensuring the collective rights of Indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources is not only for their well-being, but also for addressing some of the most pressing global challenges, such as climate change and environmental degradation. Advancing those rights is an effective way to protect waterways and biological diversity. Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals overall is not possible without fulfilling the rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources. I'd like to hand over now to Ms. Nuorgam of Finland, who's chaired the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues since April of 2019. Ms. Nuorgam, over to you.
Ms. Nuorgam, please go ahead. Can you hear us? Ms. Nuorgam, can you hear us? All right, I think we should wait 2 seconds, try to work out these issues. Ms. Nuorgam, can you hear us? All right, Elliott, I don't know if you want to kind of present some of the more key findings while we get things set up,
I think she doesn't realize that she's muted.
Yes,
I don't know if you can send her.
we're in touch with her on the technical end.
Okay.
And can you speak? Okay, listen, I think we're, Elliott, either I think if you want to kind of speak on her behalf, present some of the points, or because I'm not sure we're going to be able to get this sorted.
No, let me just perhaps ask whether any of the audience have any questions
Sure.
in the interim while we're trying to sort out Anne's connection.
We'll go to Edie Letter from the Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thanks for doing this briefing. What kind of financial assistance, money, how much does this whole project need?
Project, I'm not sure to what you're referring.
You're talking about indigenous resources to maintain them, to keep them, to ensure that they're preserved.
Yes, well, I think the key point here is to recognize and fully defend the rights that indigenous peoples have to the ownership and the management of their lands, their territories, and the resources contained therein. They've managed these resources perfectly well without any interference from outside for centuries. The problem we face right now is that by disregarding these rights, by trying to allow economic considerations defined by the majority to determine how the lands and the territories of indigenous peoples should be treated, we've managed to subvert that process. And we've inserted into that exploitation, patterns of exploitation that undermine and actually degrade and destroy those very resources that the indigenous peoples have been able to preserve for centuries. So it's less a question, I think, of resources, a dollar figure, which is how we in the modern society tend to think of every problem in terms of a dollar figure. It is more a question of respecting the fact that they know what they're doing and respecting the fact that they own these lands, they are their territories, and if we give them the right to run these territories the way they have done traditionally, we will find ourselves avoiding a lot of the damage and degradation and all of these downside risks that our sort of inept approach has imposed upon them.
Thank you. James Bays, Al Jazeera.
You're presenting all of these overall ideas. Perhaps you could give us some specific examples so that we could connect with this, examples of the sort of problems in various countries.
Well, I can give a couple of examples. One of them might be, and this is very often in the news, in the debate, is the fact that large parts of the Amazon have been and continue to be deforested in order to make space for cattle ranches or straw planting. Now, those are things that are economically, or at least in the modern economy, seen as being tremendously valuable. And that sense of value overrides the essential values and benefits that we derive from having a healthy Amazonian forest. Now, those are benefits that the indigenous peoples have derived, as I said, for many centuries, and benefits that also accrue to people who are not parts of the indigenous tribes. But because our economic model doesn't allow for us to take that into account, we tend to ride roughshod over the rights of the indigenous people, and the degradation of the environment around that and the destruction of these resources, precious resources, is the result of that. This is the same for game preserves in the Kalahari or the palm oil plantations in certain parts of Southeast Asia. And Even as far as looking at the way in which hydroelectric dams have been constructed in parts of South Asia that do infringe upon the territories of indigenous peoples and bring degradation and destruction in their wake. And these are things that have not been taken into account sufficiently because we have allowed ourselves to just ignore these rights for so long.
Okay, let's go to Rosemary Lane, the officer in charge of the Indigenous Peoples Development Branch in DESA, and then we'll take some more question. Rosemary, can you hear us, and is your microphone on?
Yes, it is. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, as we know, the chair is having some problems and we're trying to phone her in for questions, but she has asked me to read the statement that she was going to make. This is on behalf of Ms. Anne Nuorgam, chairperson of the Permanent Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, as A.S. Harris noted, along with the right to autonomy and self-determination, the right to lands, territories and resources, both of which are enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, are central to the very survival of Indigenous people, our culture, spiritual and physical survival and well-being. And yet, as we see in the news on a regular basis, conflict over Indigenous lands, territories and resources continue to be the source of human rights violations, violence and murder. In fact, the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent lockdowns has seen an upswing in cases of encroachment onto Indigenous lands and territories. The sources of conflicts are many, from resource extraction, logging, land for renewable energy resources and agribusiness, to conflict between Indigenous pastoralists, nomadic herders and farmers over shrinking grazing lands due to war and the effects of climate change, as well as the establishment of conservation areas. The lack of respect for the principle and the meaning of free, prior and informed consent by both governments and the private sector continues unabated. Today, many of the remaining unexploited lands and resources are under Indigenous stewardship. For example, the publication notes state of affairs in the Philippines and Peru is illustrative of that. In many mineral-rich countries, with 72% of all approved large-scale mining applications in the Philippines located in Indigenous territories, and 75% of the Peruvian Amazon covered by oil and gas concession. The destruction of the environment from illegal mining and logging also growing. Ecuador, Brazil, and Venezuela specifically mentioned in the publication. Only this month, the BBC exposed the illegal selling and deforestation of Indigenous lands in the Brazilian Amazon via Facebook ads. In these and many other countries, violence and persecution against environmental human rights defenders is growing. I am also concerned by the expansion of agribusiness on Indigenous lands, and particularly those that cause extensive destruction of the environment and huge loss of biodiversity. The publication notes that the impact of palm oil production is particularly profound in Southeast Asia, with Indonesia and Malaysia accounting for 85% of palm oil products. Extensive palm oil plantations existed or are planned for the territories of Indigenous peoples in a growing number of countries, including Thailand, Papua New Guinea, Cambodia, the Philippines, Colombia, Guatemala, Cameroon, Liberia, and the DRC. Palm oil does not benefit the average citizen of Malaysia or Indonesia. Most of it exported to India or Europe. Typically, projects such as these are often justified by reference to development and national interests, but do little for the national economy, while enriching a small group of middlemen with environmental devastation and human rights violations for the local people who are often indigenous. The same can be said for soybean plantations in Eastern Africa, gold mines in Guatemala, or national parks in Kenya. Monocrops such as palm oil are produced for renewable energy, which leads to the wider issue of the desecration of indigenous lands and ways of life for green energy projects. In fact, in Samiland, where Pierre lives, she says we have an issue with the construction of wind turbines and the negative effect on reindeer migrating land. Unknown to most people, many Indigenous people continue to suffer from lands that were illegally acquired for conservation and tourism, with forced relocation and bans from hunting and gathering on those lands. This is widespread in African countries, including Botswana, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, but also in various Asian countries. Not only were Indigenous people evicted and lost their source of livelihoods and culture, but most received no benefits from the revenue generated by those conservation areas beyond if they're able to establish handicraft or similar businesses close to these areas. This is another example where the rights of local Indigenous people is sacrificed for a conservation model that favors foreign tourists of the livelihoods and human rights of Indigenous people. Of course, conservation is extremely important. I welcome efforts to designate more national parks and more conservation areas. But if we're going to be serious about this, then we have to do it in cooperation with the local people and respect Indigenous rights, especially to their free, prior and informed consent. We can do so much better. We have the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People that the United Nations adopted 17 years ago. We know what it says. It's clear. We know how to talk about the rights of Indigenous people. What we need to do is follow up on this talk with real action. And for my part, and on behalf of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we're ready to work with governments on this. And I'd just like to close by saying the Permanent Forum will continue to urge member states, the private sector, as well as other stakeholders to respect and implement effectively the rights recognised in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you very much. I hope by now the chair is able to connect via phone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Toby from NHK, Japanese television. Toby?
Thanks. Thank you, Stefan. I have two questions. One is a large one and one is a small one. The small one is just a technical point. Does your report cover the case of the Wanapum or the Wanapum people or the Yakama Nation? Those are both peoples in the Pacific Northwest who've been affected by a nuclear technology site that ended up poisoning the salmon and the elk population. I'm just curious if that case study is mentioned in your report. And then the second question, well, I'll go one at a time if that's okay. Is that technical point in the report?
Rosemary, please.
I'm not completely sure on that answer right now. I would have to get back to you on that.
Okay, I'll give it a look as well. Thank you. And the second more broader point, or more broader question is, there seems to be an inherent dilemma in this sort of way of thinking between industrialization and industrial economies in general, whatever form they take, and the rights and character, the inherent value of indigenous communities and people. How do these two forces, in sort of a broader way of thinking, and these two priorities, how do they map? How can they fit together productively, both the protection and elevation of indigenous peoples? And also, you know, these large-scale socioeconomic processes that seem to be incompatible. Have we seen any positive examples of cooperation and collaboration between these two large social human forces? Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Rosemary.
I would invite ASG Harris to start this question off.
Elliott, please.
Start this answer off.
All right, thank you very much. I think one of the main points to look at here is that even before we have taken into account the question of indigenous rights, we do realize that there are certain economic processes that have a negative environmental impact. And that is the consequence of what we economists call the externalities. This situation is what also leads to us thinking that the value that we can derive from economic activity, regardless of their cost in terms of the environmental degradation or the use of the environment, use of natural resources, will always outweigh any considerations for the protection or conservation of the environment. Now, on top of that, we have the disregard for the traditional rights and privileges of Indigenous peoples in these areas. And I think that is one of the biggest problems that we face, because we've allowed, in very many areas of our social construct, we've allowed these economic interests to predominate over the human rights-based opportunities that the Indigenous peoples should have to continue managing their traditional lands, their territories, and the resources contained therein. But as well, that we've allowed the economic imperative to override the conservation imperative, to override the need to preserve the natural environment without which economic activity is fundamentally not possible. And so that is the basic principle that we are trying through the Sustainable Development Agenda and through the Conservation Agenda to deal with. And there's no incompatibility between recognizing, preserving, and extending the rights and privileges of Indigenous peoples to their lands and their territories and to their way of life, and a more ecologically and environmentally sound way of conducting our economic affairs. There can be no justification for saying it is more important for us to grow soya or to ranch cattle than it is for us to preserve a rainforest that has tremendous benefits, even if we can't count them in dollars and cents.
Thank you. Any more? If you have Ibtisam, yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Steph. So I have two questions. The first one on the issue of private companies. How do you think they should be held accountable? And I mean, is there, for example, from the UN part, is there any list regarding companies who don't or who violate human rights of Indigenous people, whether the deforesting or any other steps? And then the second question is on the US, and what do you see a very necessary or important step that the current administration should take regarding the situation of Indigenous people in this country, given also the fact that we saw that they were mostly affected, negatively affected, of course, by the COVID, for example, and many other issues. Thank you.
Elliott? Let me ask first, is Anna able to join us here? Because I think the second part of that question...
No, she's not. They've not been able to work out the sound issues.
Very well. Well, on the second part of your question, I'm not going to try to offer advice to an individual government. Thank you for trying, but no. On the larger question of how private companies should be held accountable, whether by the UN or for others, I think this is first and foremost a question of national legislation. We in the UN will continue to push all member states to ensure that the regulatory and legislative framework pays due regard and close attention to the protection of the environment, to the protection of the natural resources, because without this, we are not going to be able to realize the Sustainable Development Agenda. Without this, we are not going to be able to continue to live sustainably on this planet indefinitely into the future. The science on this is clear. And it links in as well to the biodiversity agenda, and we will continue to draw attention to the fact that practices, in basic principle, practices that are detrimental to the environment are fundamentally unsustainable, should not be tolerated, should be sanctioned. That then becomes a matter for national legislation. The UN does not have the power to go in and prevent a company from doing something or to hold accountable a company and charge them fines for environmental damage that they might do. But we will encourage all member states to keep a close eye on this, to make sure that the national legislation is conducive to sustainability, and we provide support where necessary in strengthening that kind of an approach, so that companies can be first made aware of the longer-term consequences in the environment of their activities, and show alternative ways of managing that, and secondly, be held accountable in cases where they deliberately ignore this. Thank you.
Thank you. Gloria, and then we'll let our guests go.
My question is that in situations like in Mexico, they have 80 different tribes with 80 different languages other than Spanish. they're beginning now in Mexico to unite for the common cause. This may also be the problem in other parts of Central America. The need for the tribes to unite for the cause that they all have.
Okay. Thank you, Gloria. I'm not sure that was a question, but thank you. Elliott and Rosemary, thank you. We're sorry about the technical issues, and we hope to have you back soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.